Hey, everybody, and welcome to Dr. Schwartz and Mr. Power, your cold weather source of strength, nutrition, and fitness information. I'm your host, the best name in strength, Mr. Alex Power. Here with me is my indomitable co-host, colleague, and mustachioed friend, Dr. Alex Schwartz. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. You?
Yeah, no, I'm good. Here we are, right? All right. So today we'll talk about childhood obesity and its steady rise, which is bad news. But don't despair, listener. We also have some good news. We can all use a bit of good news. So we'll be discussing the early onset of puberty, what research tells us about its relationship to childhood obesity, and why that matters. Naturally, we'll also be providing some practical advice on how to both prevent and treat childhood obesity from the perspective of a parent. And like any good podcast, we'll finish out with some Q&A. But unlike other podcasts' Q&A, our Q&A is from the future. All right, so let's get started. So I guess first things first, since this is our inaugural episode, why don't you give the audience just a brief sort of rundown on who you are and what you're doing here?
Ooh, me first. Okay, exciting. My name is Dr. Alex Schwartz, or Alexander, as people who don't like me like to call me. And my background is in exercise physiology and nutritional sciences. I did my master's in physiology and exercise physiology, more or less. And then my PhD was in nutritional sciences, where I looked at appetite regulation, how it's related to sex hormones and puberty. So this is a topic today that we chose that's near and dear to my heart.
All right, great. So I guess a little bit about myself. I'm Alex Power, also Alex. I don't consider Alexander a slur, though, and you can call me that even when you're not angry. Although nobody ever does. I've had several people say they will, but then they give up because there's too many syllables. Education-wise, I did, an undergraduate in cellular physiology, and I did a master's in cellular and molecular medicine, which is a fancy way of saying more physiology. Similarly, I'm the head coach for Yellowknife Weightlifting Club. I competed as a competitive weightlifter for a number of years ago. And I guess you did too, didn't you?
Yeah, I competed in weightlifting, thanks to you. I played varsity football prior to that. And then afterwards, for over a decade, I threw a hammer in track and field. I like to say I did track and field, but there was very little track involved. And I competed in the Highland Games as well for a little bit, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I actually remember you doing that. And I remember the pictures, and it looks fun. All right, so why don't we get into our topic of the day? So what brought this to mind for me, and that's why I brought this to you as our first topic, wasn't just that, your PhD research, but a UNICEF report came out, and I read when it first came to my attention in The Economist, and the report, well, for those who don't, I think everyone knows UNICEF, but it's the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. Anyway, so they had a report, came out a few weeks ago, and in this report, they identified that the number of children worldwide with obesity and overweight for the first time exceeded the number of children worldwide who are underfed or underweight. And so, it's kind of like a good news, bad news thing. On the one hand, this came about because there's been a reduction in, underfed and underweight children, which, is objectively good. The flip side's less great. So we have, by this statistic worldwide, looking at, pretty worldwide, 190 different countries, they came up with a statistic that 1 in 10 kids, school-age children, so that was from 5 to 19 years old, was the age group they looked at, was suffering from overweight or obesity. And this data reflects mostly middle income and high income countries, which probably doesn't surprise anybody. And I think, the image is often of, the obese Westerner, maybe on a beach in some tropical place. I typically picture the scene from Lilo and Stitch, where there's an ice cream eating gentleman with a sunburn. Anyway, but interestingly, the places with the highest prevalence of obesity were actually a few South Pacific islands. It's not, these are small places, small population wise, and they don't affect the overall statistic. Uh, but it's interesting. So apparently new, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, spelled NIUE, had a prevalence amongst kids from 5 to 19 years old of overweight and obesity at 38%, which is not trivial. Cook Islands, it was 37%. And then Nauru or Nauru,
Nauru,
I'm not
maybe?
sure,
Yeah.
and Nauru is 33%. Um, but overall, high income countries take the prize. So if you look at the US, I think the US population is something like 350 million people. So 21% of children in that age group are at either overweight or obesity. In Chile, it's 27%, and the United Arab Emirates, it's 21%. So, different cultural regions, but all middle income to rich or high income countries. Um, some notable exceptions. Japan, I looked this up because I knew Japan has pretty low incidence of obesity and overweight, less than 5% across all age groups. It's lower in kids, um, but it doesn't go over 5% for adults either. So, it's kind of interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, and then finally, here in Canada, according to the Public Health Agency of Canada, the prevalence is a little over 30%, which is terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not
That's really
great.
high. That's a pretty, that's a major public health concern. All right. So, why don't you talk about, what is overweight and obesity? Because that's, when I was explaining this to my spouse, she asked, well, how are they measuring overweight and obesity? And that's, I think, easy for us to overlook because, we consume this stuff all the time. And so, how is this measured? How did they determine, or, how generally, what are we talking about, right? Like, just ask kids, hey, how do you feel about your body fat percentage?
Well, I think it's important for, prior to talking about BMI, it's important to kind of get get a sense of why we need it. We need a tool to measure these things. So all these statistics that, you just presented quite nicely, Alex. Um,
Hmm.
we need a way to actually measure these things. So generally speaking, we can't just go to every person and measure body fat specifically with like pinching with calipers, which was an old way to do it, or with some of the advanced machines that we have to test body fat. So we need a simple way to do it and to estimate it. And so generally speaking, when we're talking about body mass index, we're talking about our mass divided by our height squared, it ends up being a value that's given to us in kilograms per meter squared. And then the way we've defined it is that with overweight, it's considered 25 to 29.9. And then 30 and up is considered being somebody with obesity. Now, this isn't perfect, obviously. It varies by age. Kids and younger, they're higher. They're higher in kids that are younger than 2, and it decreases until puberty. Then it tends to rise. And contrary to popular criticism, it actually tends to underestimate rather than overestimate obesity. Uh, this is due to ethnic variance that we see. So people who live in East Asian regions have lower average BMI, and that's partially because there's more people who are both thin with low muscularity than super muscular and lean. So yeah, it's imprecise, and it's not super precise, but it's also not underestimating overweight and obesity. Um, and I know that particularly in sort of the fitness circles that we come from, traditionally it's been an easy sort of target to punch on. But Alex and I, you and I have discussed this before, that I don't think it's actually a great thing to punch on, because generally speaking, I think people who specifically are in fitness all the time always think about, well, this doesn't work for me because I'm so jacked and my BMI according to this is 32, but look at me, I have like no body fat. It's like, but you're not really part of the 8 billion people, that like a normal sample of the 8 billion people that are on this planet. So I think that's an important
Well, I mean,
consideration.
well, yeah, I mean, just look around, right? Like, so if a listener hears that criticism, right, and I don't know that sort of does quite as much heavy lifting as it used to. But certainly when we were younger, like, in the early 2000s, you would hear this all the time, and
Hmm.
people would sort of trot out this idea that, oh, the very muscular among us, which of course everybody on the internet was, especially back then when everything was on, message boards and forums, doesn't reflect my, you know, obesity level or whether or not I'm overweight because I'm just so darn muscular. That's why my BMI is 32. And, those people certainly exist. And, younger versions of you and I certainly had significantly more musculature, certainly in our early 20s when, I was competing weightlifting and you were throwing hammer. Um, but the world's not, overrun with an epidemic of hyper muscular, people who are just like skewing this BMI measurements all over the world. Like that's just not happening. And you just have to look around to see it. So, if you do hear that, gentle listener, take it with more than a grain of salt.
Hmm.
Because I mean, well, one, it's not really what's happening. Two, if that's you, don't worry about it. Don't use it as a low key way to brag about how muscular you are. If you're genuinely lean at a 32, BMI of 32, like everybody knows it, like because that's a pretty sturdy physique. And we've certainly known people with that physique, and it's a non-trivia build. You don't have to tell people that like you're not obese. Everybody knows. And it's not, well, and that's not who they're talking about, right? Like,
No.
um, let's be honest.
Well,
As was in,
it's one of these things too, because we go back to when we were younger. But when I was playing varsity football, I would have completely skewed the scales of having a very high BMI. I think my BMI at one point was like 35, 30, somewhere between 35 and 40. I was carrying muscle, but I was carrying a lot of adipose tissue too. I was 320 pounds at my peak. So, you know, I was still bigger and stronger than a lot of people, but I was also carrying a lot of body fat, which was still putting me at a lot of health risks in spite of the fact that I was moving more and everything. So I think there's also a tendency, and it's very sports specific in this case, and in this case, it's very position specific. There's a tendency for people to kind of look at a skewed mirror with some of these things who get into these arguments, or at least it was from the demographic that I was in.
yeah. And I think, I mean, I knew you at the time, and, for again, our listeners, you're a small guy. You're what, 6'2"?
Yeah,
6'2"? Okay. So you're 6'2", big, broad shouldered guy. And in your early 20s, 320 was still, I mean,
it's too big.
that was
Yeah.
too heavy to be healthy. And, when you did, eventually trim down towards the end of playing football and took maybe a bit more of a critical eye towards your health and what would actually drive your performance. Um, and, leaning on a memory from 25 years ago or something, I think like, what did you get down to? Like 225, 230, that sort of, and you weren't like wafer thin, like you were still a big muscular guy at 6'2". So I think people, you know, underestimate how big that is,
Yeah.
like, or, not many people are lean and 250 pounds. And certainly, a few people under 6 feet tall. Um, like that is a truly exceptional specimen.
Yeah.
And again, obviously I'm talking about men. I don't know that I've ever known or seen a woman with those dimensions who is lean. That's again, when I think of men at 6 feet getting anywhere near 220 um, and reasonably lean, they have a dubious pharmaceutical
Yeah.
profile.
They start looking like a comic
Um,
book character. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's just getting, or it's as you and I had joked about, sort of like a human thumb,
Yep.
because some of the pharmacology that goes along with that sort of physique typically also goes around along with not a whole lot of hair on the top of your head. Um, and I don't know if any of our viewers have ever seen the movie, what is it called?
The
Spy
Incredibles.
Kids.
Oh, okay.
So if you have a kid or if you're a kid at that time, Spy Kids is about these kids who are spies with Antonio Banderas, and there's these characters who are like robots, and they're called thumb thumbs, and they've got thumbs for arms and legs and like little thumb heads. And, a certain amount of, you know, drug use tends to make people look like thumbs in my experience. But anyway, that's not really, where we're going with this. So again, just to recap, there's this rise in obesity among youth, with overweight and obesity. This data is coming from all over the place, but was sort of neatly summarized by this UNICEF report, which, is I think interesting because thresholds are always interesting, right? Like the numbers aren't really significantly, or not a lot has changed in the past like couple of years on this, but once you pass a threshold, like, more overweight than underweight kids, yeah, it's interesting. And
Mhm.
you get to put out a report. BMI, not a perfect measure of, body composition. And, there are ways to get better measures of body composition. Maybe we can talk about that for a sec. But the real criticism with BMI is not that it underestimates obesity or that overestimates obesity because of all the really big muscular 12-year-olds. I don't know. But rather that it underestimates it because there's also, a fair number of people who are both don't have a ton of body fat, but also don't have a ton of muscle either. And so they, register as having a low BMI, but in fact aren't in terribly good condition and have a relatively high body fat percentage. So yeah, why don't we quickly round out this part of our talk, just sort of addressing, what, some people might wonder, well, why don't we just measure, um, body fat percentage? Because that's really what we're trying to get at,
Mhm.
more directly, and sort of what some of the ways we do this are. And I think we can skip over some of the older ways, like, calipers, which looks like a pair of pliers.
Yep.
And it's got like pliers on one end and a scale on the other. It's not great. After that, I'll now let you take over, but I had a memory here of when you and I were in
When I
school,
dunked you
and
in the tank.
yeah,
All
you
right.
dunked me in the tank.
Yeah.
So you maybe describe the tank a little bit. And that wasn't super fun or easy either. And then maybe go into some of the more exotic measures currently in use, like DEXA. And it should probably be a fairly obvious reason why these aren't, used more widely.
Yeah, the tank was about the size of a room, and you had a giant scale that was there that a human could go into, and we basically just dip you into the tank, and you breathe out as much oxygen as you can. And the idea is that fat typically floats, so the more adiposity that you have, the body fat that you have, the lighter you're going to be underwater. So if you're really dense and you just have a lot of muscle and very little fat, there's a calculation that's based on cadavers, which is why you got to breathe out all that air because air is also going to make you float. So we use a calculation and it basically tells us we can get an estimate of how much body fat you have and what percentage of your body is composed of what percentage of your body is body fat of your total weight. It's
Right.
obviously,
So we're going to stop you right there,
yeah.
actually. So that's interesting. And maybe you can go on this a little bit more too, because you touched on the cadaveric nature. So, dead bodies,
Yeah.
of where we get some of these calculations from. And so, what you're describing is a tank that basically, they submerge someone in water to get, the volume, how much space they take up. And then, we know their weight. And that's all the information we have. And so based on that, we try to estimate, we use a calculation to say, okay, if you occupy this area or this volume
Hmm.
based on how much water you displace when we dunk you underwater, and, we weighed you on a scale, so we know this is your mass, we're going to calculate what proportion of your body's fat.
Hmm.
And so you mentioned it in passing, but I think a lot of people don't realize this, where those estimates come from or where the assumptions that fuel this calculation or that inform this calculation come from.
Well, likely from throwing corpses into water with a scale and then calculating the weight. Um, that's,
Okay.
I mean, there's no, a lot of this was done in medical labs. And so you can get an estimate of that. But again, you can immediately see the problem because they don't have any oxygen or they're not carrying any oxygen in their lungs. Whereas anybody, no matter who they are, who's alive, is going to have some oxygen in their lungs. So one of the things with this that makes it so difficult with this kind of a study, or measurement rather, is that you have to, when you get thrown underwater, it's counterintuitive, and you need to actually expel all of your oxygen under the water. And then when you get the measurement, the person on the outside needs to hit the tank as hard as possible. You might remember this, to tell you that we got the measurement. You can come up and breathe now. So it,
Yeah, no, it's not.
yeah, it's not
Say,
easy.
it wasn't super comfortable.
So
it sounds easy though, but it really isn't. You're underwater. You're like, okay, keep exhaling.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm trying.
And we have to do it a few times, and then you get an average measure of it. So it's relative to the calipers, it is better. And it was used sort of as the standard in labs for a long time until we started coming up with better technology. And two of the pieces of technology that we used, one was dual X-ray. Oh man, I'm gonna fail my
absorptiometry.
Yeah, absorptiometry, and it basically just does this full scan of your body. I remember running these nonstop in the lab when I was doing my master's in my undergrad. And I don't know how much radiation I got exposed to, because I remember running like 30 people in one day. It was probably not great.
It's trivial.
Yeah, it's trivial. It's like a flight. But basically it it gives you a scan of your whole body, and it's super cool because you get to see a scan of your skeleton too. And then you just kind of plug it into the machine and it calculates it. And again, everything's sort of calculated. It gives like sort of the muscle tissue, the fat tissue. It's able to kind of not dissect it, but it's able to sort of to see
like
the
distinguish between.
distinguish. Thank you. Yeah, distinguish between them.
It was definitely a D word, right?
Yes,
we knew it was going to be what dishwasher. I don't know. Other D words.
So it's funny enough, I used that a lot when I was at the University of Ottawa doing my master's. And then when I started my PhD at the University of Toronto, I was also working as a nutritionist and a strength and conditioning coach or trainer there. And I would do a lot of tests on what we call the bod pod, and the bod pod is it's the commercial name for air displacement plethysmography. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it basically, you go into this little pod. It looks like an egg, and you put like a swimsuit on, and it bases a calculation on how much air is displaced when it effectively like blows on you, like you close it off. And it's really non-intrusive, it's not invasive, it's probably the most comfortable way to measure body fat. I mean, the DEX is pretty comfortable, you just lie in there. And this one, some people might be claustrophobic, but there's a cute little window. But again, that all being said, that's
important.
Yeah, the important thing is that they're given that these are all very expensive and different levels of being cumbersome, but they're still relatively cumbersome, and they're not accessible to everybody. If you want to get a true statistic on people's health based on their body mass and body fat, then one of the easiest ways to do that is through this calculation that has been tried and tested, and it's going to give you
so basically it's easier to divide people's weight by their height than it is to lug around a DEXA scanner to test the relative composition of tens, if not hundreds of millions of children all over the world.
Right. That's exactly it.
Got it. So briefly, I'm going to just, again, for the listener here, something else to consider about calculations based on cadavers or, the dead, is that it's not a particularly, representative population. So, when you think of a cadaver and how it became that as opposed to being a live, walking, talking person, it's by one of a couple ways. One, they lived a long and fruitful life. They signed that little organ donor card and, agreed to have their body used by science to further our knowledge. Or they died in a horrible accident, or they were, suffered some condition, a chronic disease, maybe cancer, I don't know. And then they die. So all of these mean that these people are not representative of the general population. And so you have to when you consider taking the data from this and using it to essentially inform an algorithm for guessing what the, relative body composition of a healthy young adult is, it introduces some error. And so it's not ideal. So that's something to consider too. So, but you know, that's what we have. You know, we can't just dissect people for fun, right? Like, and we're better for that.
Yeah.
Um, okay, great. So I guess we should get into why do we care? I guess about obesity and overweight generally, but specifically in the context of kids. And I think it's worth just doing a very quick run. I'm sure most listeners have heard a lot of this, but obesity is linked with a laundry list of health related issues or negative health outcomes, as they say in the biz. So osteoarthritis, generalized muscle pain, type 2 diabetes, asthma, a number of cancers as you age, sleep apnea, other sleep issues, low fertility in both men and women, low testosterone in men, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, depression. I mean, it's I think we could agree without, belaboring it. This is bad. And I guess what leads us to the part about, the connection with kids is that, it's not just baby weight, right? So, there was a systematic review, a meta-analysis. We'll put a link in the show notes, the title. And I like this paper because it's open access. So if anyone who wants to read it can read it. It's certainly not the only paper or a definitive paper. But it's predicting adult obesity from childhood obesity, a systematic review and meta-analysis by Simmons and colleagues. And so that was published in Obesity Etiology. So this paper does a pretty good job of I think really connecting the dots for why we should care about childhood obesity as it relates to long-term health outcomes and adult obesity. And it's so briefly, here's what they arrived at, or, here's what they found. So children and adolescents, so they looked at, I think it was 5 to 17-year-olds with obesity and overweight were approximately 5 times more likely to become adults with obesity than children without obesity. So, if you took a group of kids with obesity overweight and you compared them to sort of normal weight kids, you would find that the obese and overweight kids would be 5 times more likely to be adults who were both overweight or obese. Yeah. So approximately 55% of children with obesity will become adolescents with obesity. So if you look at kids, pre-pubertal kids, and as they transition to puberty, 55% of them are going to become, or, the statistic is 55% of them become adolescents, so pubescent kids with overweight or obesity. So subsequently, about 80% of adolescents with obesity will go on to become adults with obesity. So you can see there's a pretty clear trend in this data, and that, the longer, if you don't intervene, it gets worse, right? So if these kids aren't able to sort of shed the weight and break out of overweight and obesity through whatever intervention, the likelihood is that they will, or it's a very high likelihood that they will become adults with obesity. And then, we're looking down the barrel at all these negative health outcomes, some of which, can materialize even before adulthood, especially, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome. These are things that we're seeing in, young kids now. Yeah. So why is this? This is one of the first things I think of when I read this is because, well, why is it that, so why does this have so much, why is it sticky?
Mm-hmm.
Why is overweight and obesity sticky? Why don't kids just outgrow it? I don't know. I think we can sort of discuss that a little bit. And there's, we won't get into the real mechanistic sort of theories on this because I don't think that's probably what people want to listen to. I mean, I guess if tons of people do, they can reach out. Maybe we'll do an episode on that. So I guess the first I would say would be, solidification of lifestyle. So I don't know if you want to sort of talk a bit about that. This was my language. That's not in the paper.
I mean, it's sort of this, it goes back to this idea of developing habits. We always hear about developing habits, but you can easily develop habits that are of a certain lifestyle. And, if kids they grow up with just eating and watching things like as you and I like doing, on occasion, everybody likes to sit down, have a meal and watch, a movie or something. But if that's normal part of their lifestyle, then that could be something, I'm not saying that's the one thing that's causing obesity, but not having a normalization of physical activity in your life, not typically, having things like treats. They're not really treats. They're just kind of an expectation after a meal. Let's say it's always normal to eat some sort of snack or treat, and it's just additional calories that go in. So there's a lot of these things that sort of we develop habits of, quote unquote, and they end up seeping into adulthood later on.
So basically, the longer you do it, maybe the more likely you are to just keep doing
Right.
it. Like that's just how it is. And I think, I don't know, I think I feel comfortable with that. Like I don't have, you know, hard data on that, but I think we can all, experientially, attest to that. The longer you do something, the more it's just the thing you do, right?
I mean, anecdotally,
Um,
you and I, we've worked with tons of different clients through the years, and it really is one of the things you work at with them, whether it's guiding them through nutrition or guiding them through strength and conditioning, is breaking habits, breaking parts of their lifestyle, trying to help modify lifestyle modification. So, I think that is an important point, and I think that is a factor.
I agree. I agree. What do you think about the idea that, there's these, if you're child with obesity or overweight and you're heading into puberty, that, there's a certain amount of the stickiness is on account of, um, the metabolic changes or developmental changes associated with, being, afflicted with obesity or overweight. So it causes problems that then make it harder to get out of this.
I think, we can dive down a deep rabbit hole again with mechanism and physiology about this. That was a lot of what I was doing my doctorate on. But we know that excess adiposity or excess fat tissue does disrupt hormones and pubertal development in what in variable directions. It could cause precocious puberty or early onset puberty. It could cause delayed puberty. But fundamentally, there is a disruption, where when you have an excess amount of body fat, it ends up resulting in things just not working the way they're normally supposed to work during development. And that could also lead it into, metabolic effects that might later in life not be great at whether it's fighting body fat or, um, you know,
Managing glucose
yeah, managing glucose. I think
or
is really
whatever. Yeah.
important.
So I guess, yeah. So I guess another point that, and this is actually kind of related, but I would take a slightly different tack on it. And that's just sort of like, advancing, worsening fitness levels. So as you get sort of more and more out of shape, as you get, as your weight creeps up higher and higher, it gets harder and harder to do anything about it, just mechanically. And so I know this runs a little bit counter to what I often hear people, say, where, if they see someone who, is quite obese and they're like, okay, well, if you would just get up and do something, it would be such a shock to, your current activity level. You just shed weight like crazy. But I mean, in addition to just being an insensitive and clueless way to speak to or about somebody, it's been my experience that it's actually untrue. So for instance, just get up and go for a walk. That's hard to do if, you suffer from, significant obesity. Like if you're, have a BMI of 36, going for a walk can be hard. And not just because, you're carrying this excess weight. But like if you go back to our list of common health problems associated with obesity, osteoarthritis and, generalized muscle and joint pain.
Hmm.
And these are, very commonly reported. And so there's again a certain inertia to achieving a very low level of fitness and a high level of obesity, in that it gets it's got its own gravity, and it gets harder and harder to pull away from it. And I think that's something where you can discuss finding people's entry point into fitness, and something that they can do that doesn't just make them feel terrible about themselves, or is just physically painful to do in the case of someone with significant levels of obesity,
Yeah.
which actually sort of plays into the final point on this, which I just calls for like a despondency effect. Um, I guess the easiest way to describe that is just, in a non-clinical way is, if you're in really poor shape, it kind of just it sucks, So, your friends, your family, your doctor, parents, whoever, like, oh, you have to get in better shape. You got to start exercising. It can feel pointless, or it can feel like you're so far away from your goal that, why bother? And then, to a previous point, even when I do bother, it hurts and I suck at sports and my balance is poor. And, that's not strictly speaking, physiological mechanism for obesity, but it's real and it sucks. And I think that needs to be considered. All right. So I guess the next thing would be, another health effect, and this goes back to your research a bit, that started to get a bit more attention as it relates to, youth or children and obesity, is its effects on puberty. Well, this is a pretty interesting one because, well, one, I think it's something a lot of people are unaware of, and two, that there's this, differential effect between boys and girls. So yeah, in girls, what you see with, childhood obesity is it tends to lead to earlier puberty, and in boys, it tends to lead to delayed puberty. So why don't you talk a little bit about that, since, that was your area of research?
Yeah. So in this idea of early or late onset of secondary sexual characteristics. So secondary sexual characteristics are things that we typically would develop during puberty. Girls get hair, body fat, breast development, hip development, menses, and increased musculature too. And boys, voices change. They get taller. Girls get taller too, but not obviously to the same extent as boys. Hair, musculature, and their hairline changes. Um, and so the thing that we've typically for and particularly with this UNICEF study too, is what it was pointing out was this idea of precocious puberty, so early puberty, and this excess amount of adiposity will lead girls to start puberty earlier, and it it was one of the things that we discussed, was that with precocious puberty that UNICEF was talking about. I specifically remember saying, well, in boys that may not always.
I think we might be, sorry, I'm gonna interrupt. I think you're, I don't, do they talk about that, or is that the other?
Maybe it's the other one. I think you might be.
Yeah. So I don't think they specifically address, it doesn't matter. I don't think
Early
they
puberty.
specifically address precocious puberty. But certainly the link is there. Sorry,
Yeah.
go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I may be mixing it up with another article. You're right. But in boys, it may not be the case, and it could be the opposite. It may actually delay pubertal development. Now, with regards to precocious puberty, why does it matter? It's this idea where it's just like, well, so what? They just hit puberty earlier and they grow up earlier and they just deal with it. But precocious and early puberty is linked to higher incidence of some cancers, including ovarian cancer. So it's more than this idea of kids are just growing up too early these days. A lower adult height, funny enough, metabolic syndrome, and there's also psychosocial effects. In terms of obesity linked delayed puberty, which was more, my cup of tea, there's less research. There was, in terms of the impact of obesity on pubertal timing and male fertility, there's been some decent publications. There's one that we have, which I believe we can link to, or we can just link my entire dissertation if people really want to go for a read.
I mean, you could do that too.
Yeah.
I just put this one in because it's an open access article. I always find it frustrating because, if you don't have, an institutional subscription to academic journals, and you listen to some podcast and, they cite some article or some, research, and you can't access it. If you're inclined to do that, and, not everyone needs to be reading the primary research, but if you want to.
Yeah, I can even direct you to certain sections where I discuss this rather than having to go through the whole thing. It's not an exciting
so yeah,
read.
you can find. But anyway, so here's an article that, we'll link it in the show notes so people can read it.
So obesity linked delayed puberty, there seems to be effect on lower bone mineral density. Oddly as well, adult height might also be impaired. And that may have something to do with basically throwing off the growth hormone and IGF-1 um, response that we normally have with puberty. So there, and the relationship that it has with estrogen and testosterone. Again, if you want to read more about it, you can we can look at my
And who
PhD.
doesn't?
Yeah, can make it two people that have read it. Plus, my committee maybe. Fertility, sperm mobility are things that may be affected, as well as cardiovascular health, increased risk of cancer, as we've talked about, metabolic syndrome, as we've alluded to as well, and again, psychosocial effects. If fundamentally, if the way you can think of it is, if kids are growing up too fast or too slow in a period where they're expected to at a certain rate of growth or pubertal development, things physiologically can go wrong down the road as well as adults.
And yeah, so just so again, for the listener, I mean, there's always a risk when you listen to health information, either, like two bozos named Alex talking about, obesity in early and late puberty, or, you're looking things up online. It's easy to hear it and panic, but I mean, first off, don't panic. It's not helpful. Secondly, like when we're talking about, early or late onset puberty, we're not talking about, a kid who is hitting puberty a little earlier. We're talking about, two standard deviations from the average
Hmm.
age, right? So for those maybe not super familiar with normal distributions and statistics, that's quite early or quite late. So in the case of, early onset puberty, I think we're looking at, like, 8 years old for a girl or 9 years old for a boy. Similarly, and did I say early? Yeah,
Yeah,
early
yeah.
onset. And then for late onset puberty, we're looking at like 15 for a girl to have her first period, or 16 for a boy to not be really entering into puberty. So I think we have some information on this a bit later in the podcast, but it's, these are non-trivial excursions from the normal time that you would begin puberty,
Hmm.
right? This isn't the kid who starts a year late. We're talking about like quite early, quite late. Um, so yeah, I think that's worth mentioning again, just because I don't want to be, just giving people things to worry about, especially parents, just because being a parent, you spend a lot of time worrying
It's just
already.
worrying. Yeah,
That seems to be honest, a pretty big part of the activity in my
yeah.
experience,
Me too.
or the experience. Okay. Uh, all right. So I think we've covered sort of what is early, or what is childhood obesity? Why does it matter? There's the stuff I think people are more familiar with, like just the general obesity related health concerns, or health impacts, and then some of the maybe lesser known ones, like its effects on puberty and how that's linked to negative health outcomes. The question is, what can we do about it? And so I thought we would look at this through the lens of, not like a sort of a clinical or scientific lens, although that should inform our approach, but, as a parent. So you're a parent, you're listening to this, or maybe you want to be a parent one day, or a parent, or maybe you just think this is interesting, or maybe you're a trainer or a coach. What do you do? Because I think, if we go back to the paper we cited before by Simmons, where they looked at, the effects of, or what was the outcome for children of overweight and obesity. It shows it matter. This matters, right? Like we need to address this. And I think the first thing I'd like to say though is, what I don't want to say is, move more, eat less. Um, I find this particularly irritating because, there's this tiny little bit of truth in it. We do have to balance energy and energy out, but it's also like unhelpful and insensitive, and it doesn't get you any closer to understanding or coming up with a real strategy for addressing it.
Mm.
So, how do we do that? And so why don't you sort of take it from there and talk a bit about, again, not to discourage people, but maybe frame how challenging this can be.
Yeah, so the elephant in the room is effectively that the research doesn't show encouraging results from lifestyle interventions, or at least not long term. So what do we mean by this? So short term, diet and exercise seem to have a positive effect on body composition. Kids and adults as well lose adipose weight when they undertake a calorie deficit and they exercise. But the problem is that these things end, and after they end, post intervention, most people gain back the majority of their lost fat. So interventions need to be long term, and when we say long term, we mean forever. And even then, it's tough. It's tough to maintain these things.
Right. So I think, it shouldn't be, I guess, either understated or overstated. Like on the one hand, like again, don't panic. Like this isn't an argument to not bother trying, for a few reasons. One, um, even if your weight doesn't or your BMI doesn't change, there's positive effects associated with exercising more. Um, Not least of which being sort of a recomposition of your body. So
Mhm.
maybe your weight doesn't change, but you gain some muscle, you lose a little bit of fat, or recomposition, as the kids in the know like to say. And even if there is no change in body fat percentages, there is some, positive effects on, cardiovascular health, or blood sugar management, or insulin response to eating, and those, but that all still
Mhm.
happens. So be active; it's good for you. Likewise, and I think this is where it becomes particularly difficult. You need to eat fewer calories, and that's the so-called eat less part of this, and I think that's the hardest thing to affect long term. Um, but yeah, it has to be forever. And I think instead of seeing that as discouraging, it should just inform your approach, right? So how do we do this in a way that isn't terrible, right? Because you don't we don't want people upending their lives in a way that they hate forever, and they won't anyway, right? Like, no one's going to do that. I mean, we can talk about like, oh, we don't want you to, just eat this, you know, terrible diet that'll cause you to lose weight forever. And well, don't worry, they won't.
Yeah.
No one's going to do that. Um, so yeah, what are some long term strategies? What do we need to do? And I think so. Here's some of the things that we think are good long term strategies. So I guess, yeah, why don't you just sort of start in on this, and I'll come in a little bit later, maybe pepper you with
Ooh,
questions.
pepper. Good job. I like the use of pepper because the
Yes.
first thing I want to talk about is the thing that gets a lot of attention is the food environment. So, what kind of food do we have around us? What's available, and especially for kids, we effectively control that as parents. So, what do we have available? Do we have any options for kind of snacks like fruits, veggies? I know there's a whole thing kids don't love veggies, but that's not necessarily true either. They just maybe it's the way they're prepared. Maybe they like some vegetables and don't like others. I mean, adults, it's the same thing. But just in general, having kind of this quote unquote empty calories that are readily accessible and readily consumed isn't the best kind of environment for food. So that's one idea of food environment. Then there's also the non-food environment. So we can think of these two environments, and that's effectively the rest of your life, and that includes exercise, and that as as just part of a lifestyle. It doesn't mean like you need to go work out or, necessarily just signing your kid up for sports, which I think is important, but it also means normalizing physical activity and exercise and making an enjoyable part of their lives. Like it's normal for them to be active and do things. And it's a great way to, for people to do stuff with their kids, just do stuff that's physically active that you can both enjoy, move around. Because as Alex himself has said, when you're moving around, you're not shoving food in your mouth. I mean, you could try, but it's rather difficult to do that, and it's a choking hazard.
It's
Yeah,
messy.
it can get.
It's definitely messy. Yeah, and I think you mentioned that kids don't control their environment. I think this is really worth sort of going into a little bit more, because it's at the end of the day, especially for pre-adolescent kids, or kids up to like to 10, 12 years old. They don't have jobs. They're not buying groceries. They don't stock the cupboards, and they're not putting things in the
Yeah, they
fridge.
don't pull
So
their weight.
yeah, I was gonna say, we need to go back to the good old
Yeah,
days when kids labored all day in cotton mills or cotton gins, and brought home a paycheck at the end of
yeah,
it. But it's I don't want to say unfortunately, but it can be tough sometimes to sort of recognize, or like, this is a parent issue. And again, I'm not criticizing people's parenting. I'm just drawing attention to the fact that as a parent, you define the universe of your kids for the most part, right? Like, they're not stopping for donuts on their way to work. They eat the food that's in the house. And if you're looking at making a long-term changes in, the kid's lifestyle, it's going to have to be in yours too, in all likelihood. And that can be a little bit tough. But it should also be encouraging because, at the end of the day, you hold the reins as the parent, and it's in your power to affect this. It might not always be fun, especially if you're, doing large changes in your kid's life. They're not going to be thrilled about the changes necessarily, but I mean, kids aren't thrilled with a lot of things, and you do it anyway because it's in their best interest. Um, and ultimately, long term, that they're going to be happier and healthier and better off for it. So, a lot of our advice does center around, changing the environment at home, changing the world that your kid lives in, because you can actually do that for a kid. It's harder with an adult because, you know, we have autonomy and agency on some level. And, if you want to go to the store and buy a donut, I can't stop you.
Mm.
But in the case of a kid, if there's no, you know, if the food in the house supports healthy eating, then the food they eat supports the health.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that, that has to be stressed, even though, we're actually talking about is changing the lifestyle often of a whole family. All right. So that's, I guess, that's sort of the general advice. And so if we go back to our, move more, eat less thing, which again, I don't love, but, there is an exercise component, and that's important. It's part of this, right? We do have to increase activity levels. Um, Although it's worth mentioning that it's not always for the reason you think. And, there's a bit of a truism. It's not like strictly 100% true, but, like most truisms, but there is truth in it. And that's that, you can't outrun your diet. And what we're speaking to, or what we mean when we say that, is people often grossly overestimate how many calories they're burning when they exercise. And it's not as many as we would all like. And so it's really easy to out eat how many calories you take in, because it just is. And particularly with calorie dense foods, it's just, you don't burn that many calories exercising, and eating a few hundred extra calories is trivial and easy and often enjoyable.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I point people to on this is another paper that I found that's a good, it's a narrative review. So it's just, talking about the literature and sort of the current state. It should be viewed as a bit of a, it's not a meta-analysis or anything, but it covers the big topics, and it's open access. So again, people can read it if they want. We'll link it in the show notes. And that's Physical Exercise and Appetite Regulation, New Insights. And that's by Caruso, Zoli, and Vaccarezza.
Yeah.
I don't know. And yeah, so we'll link that. But anyway, yeah. So why don't you talk a little bit about this, Alex? Because again, like, it's burning calories is important, but there's, as the title of that paper suggests, there's other effects too.
So people with overweight and obesity seem to have a mismatch between appetite and energy expenditure. And exercise seems to bring that back into more of a balanced state. Exercise has this effect that we like to call the anorexigenic effect, where, again, people might find this somewhat ironic, especially in the context of food marketing centering around products that fuel our performance. But exercise might make you actually a little bit less hungry, particularly with higher intensity exercise as well. Now, the effect's not huge, but it does seem to be a piece of the puzzle. It displaces low energy using activities and habits as well. So if you go in and bust your butt, you're not sitting on your butt. So I know, again, it sounds silly and kind of simple, but it's a thing. There is a relation.
Well, maybe thinking of that as like a dual effect,
Right.
right? Of sitting around.
Yeah, because
exercise doesn't burn that many calories, but sitting around, eating or, watching a movie, having a snack, which I enjoy, not only am I not burning a lot of calories, but I'm also taking in extra calories, and often, pointless, delicious calories. But, it's sort of a 1-2 punch
Yeah,
effect.
exactly. And I mean, it's not for nothing. Long-term effects of improved fitness and muscle mass can offset some of the health impacts of obesity and overweight more directly. One of the things that I love to when I was training people who were just starting out, was always tell clients, people are always looking for this immediate effect or people want a quick effect. Well, one of the things that happens almost instantaneously with any kind of physical activity is that your muscles, they need that, they want that glucose back. And so we start becoming a little more sensitive to insulin, just off the hop from even one session. It's like this idea of a glucose sink. So, it's not something that you'll necessarily see in the mirror or the scale, but it is something that is physiologically beneficial. And I think it is an important point to sort of bring home that the moment you start being physically active, good things are happening to your body. You may not see it. Sometimes you might not even feel it, but good things are happening to your body. And, you should be encouraged by that. So,
Yeah, so anything's better than
right,
nothing,
right.
right? I think that's maybe and for those who don't know, like this idea of this, this glucose sink, or, that there's improved insulin sensitivity right away. What we're talking about is, staving off insulin resistance, or which is, your first step towards, or one of the first detectable steps towards type 2 diabetes, which, you know, pretty much everyone should be familiar with and agree that it's bad and you don't want that.
That's right. It's not great.
All
Yeah.
right. So no, 0 stars would not
Yeah.
recommend. Um, Bad review on
Yeah.
Amazon. All right. So I think that gives like a good idea on, maybe some things people don't know about, why, exercise is good, not from a weight loss perspective or a weight management perspective, not just because it burns calories, which it does, but, it affects other things like the, health outcomes, apart from weight, and, helps regulate appetite, and is just, and makes you feel good, and it's good for you. So do it. Um, so that brings us to the diet side of things. And I think for most people, honestly, this is the harder part. Exercising, once you get into it, it's actually pretty fun. Like, most people enjoy exercise. Especially, find something you do enjoy. You don't have to go to the gym. You don't have to, run a marathon. Just find a thing you like and do it. And then you're having fun.
Hmm.
Eating is the rest of the day, every day for the rest of your life. And it takes a lot of work. And not just because, you're changing what you eat, or you're changing the amount, or that there's a certain amount of sort of restriction involved. But because if you want to eat well, you have to have good food prepared or ready. And so some of the advice I think maybe people don't hear as much, but is actually really good practical advice, is learn how to cook, learn how to plan. And so, again, not telling anyone, you don't know how to cook, but, learn to cook better, learn to cook things that are, more supportive of your health, and learn to cook enough of them that enough of it per cooking session that you have food later to eat. And this is part of your learning to plan. So if you have good, healthy food available that supports your goals, it's easier to resist, ordering a pizza,
Hmm.
which is, the go-to, or, whatever your go-to when you haven't prepared food, when, you're midway through the week and, you have to eat, but you don't have anything healthful prepared. And, this is often where the slippage occurs. And so I think that's, as opposed to, specific, eat this food, don't eat that food, hit these macros, don't, hit those macros, learn to cook well in a way that supports your goals, learn to plan well. And this is an ongoing thing, and this is, I think, goes back to the, the long-term lifestyle component, and the ongoing support and learning process that is trying to, create an environment that helps you achieve your goals.
I will say that
Um,
I think Alex, for listeners there, Alex Power is quite a good cook, and so if you're looking for any kind of food advice, he would be the person to turn to. He's a lot better than I am. I've never been disappointed by meals he's made for myself and my family and his family. Um, And yeah, they're pretty awesome. I just also purchased, total side note, but I purchased a pressure cooker and I'm very excited to try and use that.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice. Yeah, they could. I mean, they can save a lot of
Hmm.
time, right? So, um, and lend themselves to large batches of
Yeah.
food,
Which for
right?
me
And
is
that's
really
again,
a big thing right now, which is why I got it, because having a 5.5-year-old trying to prepare meals, this is a challenge, and I want to prepare meals that aren't bad, and I don't want to go to our go-to Chinese food place, which is oh so good, but not the healthiest option. Um, but yeah, it is one of these things where that's been for me even a recent change that I'm very excited to implement. Looking up all these recipes to make these batch meals for myself and the family.
what I think that's particularly because we're talking about, childhood obesity. Parents are busy,
Yeah.
and I'm a parent, but my daughter's almost 18, so it's a lot less work than it was. We're at a stage where she can take care of herself
Hmm.
for a lot of things. But young kids are hard and they take a lot of time, and having meals prepared ahead of time, having things ready when they come home from school or when you come home from work goes a long way. And I think this is where the lifestyle planning piece you know really shines, and this is what gets you through it.
Hmm.
um and so, with that in mind, I think we talk a little bit about specific food recommendations, but I don't think any of these are going to really surprise people. And I don't think we need to even spend too much time on it. If people want this from us, we can certainly provide it, and, send us a message and we could do an episode on specifics. But, the standard recommendations apply, right? So not too much processed food or, overly processed food. Um, it tends to have a low water content, high salt content, high fat content, which all work together to make you eat more and be less full.
Hmm.
This has been, demonstrated over and over. It's an area of, active research at the moment, and everyone's throwing around terms like, what is it, the NOVA scale or NOVA categorization for, what is it, not extremely processed food.
Oh, FODMAPs, and yeah, there's all sorts
Yeah,
of different classifications.
right.
Yeah.
So we're talking about like very processed foods. It doesn't
Highly
matter. I think most
processed.
people
Yeah.
know what they are.
Yeah,
Highly
highly
processed
processed food.
foods. Again, they're not all bad. I mean, protein powder is a highly processed food.
Yeah.
Um, it's probably most people can't stomach enough of it to make themselves obese. Um, but it's, these are general guides, right? So reduce the amount of processed food that you're eating. Increase the amount of, fiber you're eating, and not just, taking fiber drinks, but foods with
Hmm.
fiber in it, right? Like, so you'll see a pattern in this. Eat more fruits and vegetables. Well, these are foods with lots of fiber in them. Um, and they tend to keep you full for longer. They're full of phytochemicals, which is a name we just give to things that we haven't really, you know, might not all fit into the same chemical group, but all seem to do good things for
Yep.
you. Um, more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, legumes, etc. And I'd like to, I guess, sort of say, like, this doesn't have to be really expensive, right? People talk a lot about how, healthy foods are more expensive, and they can be, but if you're savvy, it's not always the case, especially if, you lean towards a more, vegetable centric diet, or, plant based,
Hmm.
not vegetable, even though those are vegetables, sort of an imprecise term. But, a bag of lentils, it's not expensive. You get a 2 kilogram bag of lentils for a couple dollars maybe. And it's very nutritious. It's good for you. And if you know how to cook, lots of really delicious recipes
Yeah.
based on that, right? So this is where the learning comes back in, learning how to cook, learning how to plan. Um, and again, none of that's meant to diminish, the challenges of food costs. It's real. But again, you don't have to be buying, tropical fruits in January. There are ways to try to, if you're savvy and with a bit of work, costs can be kept more reasonable. Again, not trivializing it. And then finally, I'll let you talk about this. Lean protein sources. This is, dual effect. One, you need your protein. Two, fats. Calories add up twice as quickly as other nutrients in terms of the calories add up. Yeah, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah,
My awkward
lean.
wording.
So a lot of protein that people ingest typically does, as you said, have quite a bit of fat in it too. Think of like a typical thing people think of with protein, a big piece of steak. It's got a lot of protein in it, but also has a lot of fat in it. So the idea is to have lean sources of protein, but don't worry so much about high protein. Um, Adequate protein is important, but inadequate protein isn't the one thing that's causing childhood obesity. There's this idea with a high amount of protein. Protein has more of a thermic effect on food versus carbohydrates versus fat. What that really is that when you eat foods, it takes a certain amount of calories to process these foods. And so protein takes a little more, it takes more calories to effectively process them. But it really is, in the grand scheme of things, trivial. It was a big deal for a while in the fitness industry. It's part of the components that make up the total amount of energy that your body uses in a day. You have like the basic amount of energy that your body needs to survive, as well as things like moving around and physical activity. And thermic effect was a small percentage of that. It varied anywhere between 5 to 10%, which in the grand scheme of things, it's not really that critical and not the thing that's going to make or break somebody who's trying to, lose weight. Effect and satiety is also variable. It may not be a unique effect compared with other constituents or whole foods. So the idea behind that is that, pro we've said that protein typically induces more satiety or makes you feel more full than other foods, than other food constituents, so more than carbohydrates, certainly more than fats. And yeah, that may be the case, but nobody's just going to eat um, strictly protein or strictly carbohydrates in a meal. We eat foods, we eat meals. This was also a problem, as a side note, which could be another podcast, about the glycemic index, which we've used for measurements, which is a useful tool. But the problem is that you're looking at a full load of a meal, which, if one food might be really high in the glycemic index, which they consider not good. And again, we can talk about that in different podcasts. Is it offset by the fact that you're eating an entire meal with a bunch of other things that have different loads, quote unquote, on the food, and how that's processed? So again, like, we need to always think of these things that typically in health and nutrition, we have this idea that, oh, this is good, this is bad, and every few decades or so, it seems to always shift gears. So for a long time, carbs were really bad, and then prior to that, fats were really bad, or something's really good. But in reality, we eat whole meals, we eat foods together. And so we need to kind of approach that a little more holistically. So think of it that way, that we're not, it's not just one bad thing, but it's everything combined that we need to consider. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so, sorry, are you
No,
done?
yeah, I mean, in terms of just going through a few more points, people they are going to want to reduce the amount of fats or lipids they eat. So this tends to just happen spontaneously when processed foods are reduced, and high fiber foods are increased. So high fiber is going to make you feel more full, and processed foods typically have quite a bit of fat in them, because fat's delicious and it's got fat and salt, as Alex was talking about. It should get mentioned anyways, though, so it's important to kind of look out for that. Track your food. So Alex, if you want to discuss that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I think tracking food, especially, if you're of a certain vintage, in the past, that was sort of characterized as, I don't know, I guess adjacent to disordered eating. So, if you're tracking your food, it's, you're obsessed with your diet, and, this is bad. It's a bad relationship with food. Um, I don't think that's fair. And frankly, I don't think it's true, right? You just have to approach it with the right attitude. Because at the end of the day, if you don't know how many calories you're eating, you don't know how many calories you're eating. And you could argue that you don't strictly need to know that. And I think for maybe a more experienced person who, has a better sort of intrinsic understanding of how many calories are in certain foods, that might be the case. But I think for the uninitiated, and I wouldn't do this with a kid because, I mean, they're kids, but maybe with an adolescent, and certainly with adults, you should spend at least some time, even just like a week or two, tracking everything you eat. With approximate amounts of food, what type of food, how it was prepared. One, it's usually pretty eye-opening. People are very poor at, estimating how many calories they're eating. Even, they've done research with nutritionists where they've asked them to sort of estimate how many calories they're eating. And, this is their job. And they're, grossly incorrect with, their estimates. And so this is, tracking what you eat, even just for a little while. It's eye-opening, it's educational, and it gives you a real sense of, what you're eating, when you eat it, and, where you can make interventions. And, this is, I think everyone should do this at some point who's, a teenager or older, not little kids.
Anecdotally,
So,
I
yeah,
also, when I was teaching at the University of Toronto, I was teaching undergraduate courses, and one of the courses was an introduction to human nutrition. And so one of the first things that I had the class doing was just doing a food log activity, so tracking the food. A lot of them loved it, but it was such an easy way for them to kind of get a sense of what they were eating day to day and take a look at how it compares to sort of like the norms that we have and the standards that we set and the recommendations that we give. A lot of countries have certain recommendations, and we use Health Canada, but just even how does it compare to that? And it was more of a thought experiment, but for a lot of them, it's the first time they have any kind of experience in nutrition, and the easiest way to sort of create this laboratory of your own where you're recording what you eat, and it's very simple. But the feedback I'd get from quite a few students was always that it was eye opening. Students would always think I felt like I was getting enough protein, and they were getting like zero, like 0 grams through the day. Because university students, this idea they're just eating ramen noodles all day, because it's cheap and kind of gross. Put some water in it, which I didn't do.
I like noodles.
I love ramen noodles too.
I like instant noodles.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna
yeah.
lie. Um,
But it wasn't.
I wouldn't base a diet around them, but they're
But
great.
for a lot of these students, it was a first year nutrition course. They may never take another nutrition course again, and at the very least, they came out of it understanding how food that they take is related to study, like science of what we do. The science of physiology and whatnot. And that's the connections that I was trying to make. And it's such an easy bridge to make with um, understanding our bodies more, right? As I tell them in class, there's a lot of skills that we acquire, a lot of things that we learn in school that we may never learn about again or even touch again. But from the moment you're born until you die, you need to have food in your body. So it's one of these things that I think is important to have.
There's your soundbite.
That's soundbite. It's such an important piece of knowledge to have throughout your lifetime.
For sure. All right. So I guess the final piece is like because we mentioned this. I believe I mentioned it earlier, but when you seek medical intervention, and I think that's a bigger issue now than it's ever been, because for the first time, really, there's effective medical interventions that can be had. And so, up until 2020, there was, if you went to the doctor with any of these issues, or certainly with obesity related issues, uh, you might come away fairly empty handed, not because they don't know or care, but because there really wasn't a whole lot to be done. And so I guess again, we break this out into two bits based on, what we've discussed so far. One is the obesity component, and that's a bit tougher because, when do that's going to vary from person to person, what they're comfortable with, when they think that's, an intervention is appropriate, especially for their kid. And then there's the puberty piece we discussed, and that's a bit more straightforward because that's, a bit more, I think, intuitive for people as a medical issue, right?
Mhm.
Um, so in the case of, we talked about precocial puberty or, very early onset puberty. So, if you've got a girl who's showing clear signs of puberty by 8, or a boy who's showing clear signs of puberty by 9, it might be time to go visit a doctor, right? And maybe it's nothing, we're not physicians, we're not medical doctors. I'm not a doctor of any kind, either PhD or MD, but it's worth a visit, right? And again, not to panic, but check it out. There might be something there. And then in the case of late puberty, it's a little bit trickier, particularly in boys, but in girls, if they haven't had a period or if they're not menstruating by 16, it might be time to go to the doctor, right? Or again, there's no harm in checking it out. They can do some tests, try to evaluate what's going on hormonally. The guidance, like if you look up, when should you be concerned? They often talk about breast development in girls. But I mean, a lot of girls don't. I mean, a lot of women have very little breast development. So I think the period's a better one to go by,
Mhm.
especially if you're not talking about obesity and just puberty's coming late in a girl. Just ask her, have you had a period yet? As a parent, you probably know anyway. But if you don't, hey, just ask. In boys, it's a little tougher because they talked about if you don't have testicular enlargement by 14, this is a sign of late onset puberty. Now, obviously checking, testicular size in your 14-year-old is invasive, um, at least a little bit awkward. But, if there aren't other outward signs of, puberty starting up, like, the boy's voice isn't changing or, there's no hair development in the armpits or legs, all its peers are starting to hit growth spurts. He's not. It might be time again
Mhm.
for a visit to the doctor. And that's, they we don't even need to get into what they do, but that's who we go to for that. You don't go to a trainer, you don't go to two guys on a podcast. If your
Yeah.
kid's not hitting puberty or if they're hitting puberty super early,
Endocrinologist.
um,
Uh,
yeah, talk to
and they'll
somebody
use
who
a
studied
Prater
that.
orchidometer to it's basically it looks like a beaded
Exactly.
necklace. Yeah.
Yeah. So what Alex is referring to here, of course, is that they check testicular size, which again, as a parent, you probably don't want to do.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of medical support for obesity, um, yeah, this is until recently you probably wouldn't have gotten a lot of traction with this, but uh, it's they now I know with GLP-1 agonists you have that's been approved for 12-year-olds
I,
for 12 years old and up, I
mhm.
believe, as an intervention. So again, we're not you know, prescribing or endorsing that because we're not physicians. But it's crazy what they're doing with this drug. This is like changing
Yep.
lives in a positive way. I think a lot of coaches and trainers kind of both position themselves against this because it runs counter to the narrative of what they're selling, which is lifestyle intervention. But I mean, as far as I'm concerned, these are taking away the hardest part for a trainer to deal with, and trainers should welcome this
Yeah. And it's
these
also
interventions
not taking
as
away from a lifestyle intervention.
right. So if your coach or your trainer is, trying to talk down GLP agonists or saying, oh, this is, in some way cheating or, not doing it the right way, like walk away. I'll just say that. And you don't even have to come to us, but walk away from them. This person is either, some combination of either misinformed or, doesn't have your best interest at heart, or both. I don't know, but just go somewhere else. Yeah, so physicians, they have access to, well, they can write scripts for things like GLP agonists. They can rule out other health issues like, ovarian or pituitary disorders that might be, the source of concerns around late or early onset puberty. Um, and also, I guess the last one is, some places do offer, these integrated care models where you have, obesity clinics or lifestyle clinics, which pair physicians with nutritionists or, other lifestyle intervention coaches or professionals. These are still pretty rare that they exist. And if you have one, if you have access to one, then yeah, access it, these are, I guess, innovative approaches and they, square with, best practice recommendations from people who give best practice recommendations. So if you can access that, I encourage you to do so. And of course, you can always reach out to us. We're not physicians, but if you're looking for coaching, whether diet coaching or training, strength conditioning, that sort of thing, hey, check us out. We're on YouTube. Praxis Strength and Nutrition is our YouTube channel. Listen to this podcast, or you can go to praxispn.com. Uh, we'll put a link in the show notes. Drop us a line, let us know what you're looking for, and yeah, hopefully we can accommodate. Yeah, so I guess that's the end of the bulk of it. And I promised questions, a Q&A, because yeah, all shows should have a Q&A section. Uh, and yeah, since this is our first episode, our questions are from the future, which I don't know. Hmm. All right. All right. So I'm not sure if Alex is going to be in this final piece just because of technology. So I'm going to handle the Q&As by myself. So first question is from Michelle Terrio. All right. Hi, guys. Love the show. This question is for Alex Power. Did you remember to lubricate the bathroom door? It's been squeaking for a while now, and you said you'd fix it. Case. Okay. Second question. Hopefully this one's a little more relevant to the podcast. This is from Schmalix Schwartz. Sounds a lot like your name. All right. Longtime listener, first time question asker. First off, I want to say you guys are hilarious, and I love the entertaining, and frankly sexy twist you put on your content. Okay. Do you recommend any specific type of activity for kids and adolescents? Yeah, no, I don't. I think, there's a tendency to push kids or, for trainers to push what they know, right? So if you're talking to strength and conditioning people, they want you to get kids into the gym. Gym owners certainly want to, or people who are selling fitness to kids want to get kids into the gym. But it doesn't matter what they do, really. And this applies to adults too. Do something you like, right? Get a kid into something they like. Because the point is for it to be something you stick with, right? If you're forcing your kid into something they hate, and I'm not talking about like just, first pass, the kid kind of doesn't want to do it because they're shy or uncomfortable, but then they end up liking it. But if your kid doesn't like this, or if you don't like it, if we're talking about an adult, you're probably not going to stick with it. So, the only conditions being that it needs to be sufficiently difficult. You should probably do something that both taxes, your aerobic system. So, some cardio aerobic stuff, and you should do something that promotes strength development. So some sort of strength training, but it doesn't have to be in the gym. It doesn't have to be running a marathon, riding a bike, but it has to be something. All right. So last question is from Noah Lott. All right. So what do you guys think of the enhanced gains or so-called untested drug games? I've been hearing about it, and I was wondering if you have a take. By the way, you guys have the best outfits. Have you considered billing yourself as the best dressed guys in strength and nutrition? I don't know, Noah. We might just do that. All right. So I guess the enhanced games. Yeah, no, we do have a take on this. And if you tune in for our next podcast, you can get a deep dive into precisely what we think about it, what questions it thinks it's asking and answering, if it's actually doing that. And yeah, all the hottest hot takes. Yeah. All right. So I'm not sure we're recording, Alex. I'm going to assume we are. But just in case we aren't, I'm gonna close this out without him. He's gonna say goodbye at the end, and hopefully it works. So yeah, if you have any questions, this is our thing, this self-promotion component. You can send them to us at praxispn.com. If you have any strength and nutrition or related health topics that you want us to cover, let us know. Maybe we'll do an episode on it. And yeah, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, or, get Praxis tattooed all over your body. Have shirts printed up with the two Alex's faces on it. Yeah, everything. Do you have anything to add, Schwartz?
Got a forehead tattoo.
Forehead tattoo. That's what all the kids are doing. All the biggest pop stars. Mm-hmm. You could be the next big pop star. Probably a face tattoo is the only thing standing in your way.
That's right. It's science.
Science. Yeah. And we're a science-based podcast, so we have to endorse that. Okay, great. So until next time, have a great week, everybody.
Take care.